Chapter 2, in which I encounter young revolutionists, old soldiers, fresh friends and foes. I also fall in love. As they unlimbered carbines from their sturdy young backs, the martial party also moved their horses to form a wall across my road. At this I considered throwing myself on their mercy, of surrendering in the hope they were regular soldiery, famously more merciful than the people's peacekeepers. I instantly experienced self-disgust. Since I was to die anyway, I determined to do so with a degree of dignity. Thus disposed, I put the point of my sabre to the frozen ground, and my wrist upon my hip, in the attitude of a duellist awaiting his on guard. However, when 6 brown besses bellowed in unison, I was astonished, for the accuracy of the English gun was famous, first, that I was not struck, and secondly, I was not the target at all. I turned my head. 4 of the National Guard were down. 1 horse kicked on the ground with red foam starting from his mouth. 2 men gasped over cracked leg bones, while 2 more, with arms flung back against the snow, were stone dead. Monsobier himself was in momentary retreat, riding hard for the security of what remained of his squadron, and yelling of "Demmed Swiss gentlemen bandits!" Of a certainty his description could have been truth. The young men shooting from the saddle were all decently dressed, used to hunting customs, and were armed in uniform, even to the swords at their belts, though the fashion they adopted was a year or 2 past. I was reminded of a youthful German landowners taking the opportunity of a holiday jaunt to Munich or Nuremberg, but their sashes, I would swear, contained the red, white and blue of revolution. I decided we must surely be in Switzerland. Monsobier knew, as well as I, the French government's policy for respecting Helvetian territory. Angering the Swiss Confederation could hamper France's policies elsewhere. If Monsobier took my mysterious allies for Swiss, well then Swiss they must surely be. My adversary was wounded. Even as he rode, he clutched his shoulder, swaying badly. Reaching his own ranks, he lost his balance in the saddle and then fell directly into the arms of a comrade whose own leg was damp with blood. The great black Spanish courser drew up her knees, snorting her bafflement at being suddenly riderless. Fate offered a favoured second. Sword in hand, I demanded all of my legs and ran towards my pursuers, met them first head on, cut him down, and with a final thrust of my calves mounted Monsobier's Spaniard, turning her round once more towards Switzerland and the unknown landsmen. These elegant youths were casually repriming their muskets as I galloped up. They were laughing and talking amongst themselves like lordlings at the pig shoot, careless or unexpectant of retaliation. "Oh, I'm much obliged, gentlemen," said I with a finger to my hat. One of their number, a boy with red cheeks and yellow hair, bowed in his saddle, always ready to serve a citizen of the Republic. His French was uninspired, his accent German by his gutturals. "Those Swiss dogs have no nerve for an honest fight, eh, brother?" "Just so," said I, baffled by his logic, but grateful for the mistake. "Just so, citizen." I was close to laughter as I realized how Monsobier, by choosing to travel incognito without flags or cockades, had defrauded himself of my skin. The Germans again levelled their muskets on their shoulders, but this time they fired high in impressive unison, at which Monsobier and his remaining men made their way with unseemly haste to the terraces and bushes of the valley walls. For a moment my herborist pursuer stood upright, scowling and shaking his healthy arm at me. "You've not escaped for long," cried he, like a brigand in some Ritter und Räuber tale. "I'll find thee, von Beck." But I was laughing hard behind my hand, realizing I was the only one of us to be wearing the full sash in favour of the revolution. He hesitated and then turned his back sharply, stamping up the hillside until he was gone from sight. "See them scamper," One of the merry youths rocked in his saddle and joined me in my laughter. "Is this France, monsieur?" I used my amusement to disguise my further surprise and managed to utter a muffled, "I thought this Vaud in Switzerland." The red-cheeked spokesman holstered his musket and rode closer to me. "In confidence, sir. We're lost. We were seeking the border when we came upon you." "Well, I'm mighty pleased you did, sir. Pray, why do you travel to France in these times?" He was proud of his moral nobility. I saw in him my own self of only a few years since. "We go to offer our services to the Revolution in the name of the Universal Republic." I retained some fragments of my old conscience, and believed I owed it to them to reveal at least an outline of what they must now find in France. "The Revolution will welcome you as she welcomed me," said I, and I began to mop sweat from my forehead. "Where do you come from, gentlemen?" The answer to this simple question was also of some pride to them. A swarthy little cockerel in a red-hedged tricone on a slightly yellowed wig walked his horse past me. "2 from Poland, 2 from Bohemia, 1 from Venice, and 1 from Waldenstein," he informed me. He reached my fallen saddlebags and leaned down to pluck them up. He rode back as slowly as he had gone. "We're part of a club, monsieur, dedicated to republicanism and the rights of man. We were chosen by our fraternity to ride to France to offer our services to the cause. We are only 6, but we are the representation of more than 100 others. Their subscription equipped us." "Gold well spent," murmured I, with considerable sincerity and gratitude, since they had saved my life. "I am named Alexis Krasny," said the leader. He pointed out his comrades, one by one. "Stefanik," moon-faced and bashful. "Polyakov," assured, but a little dim-witted by the look of him. "Stazakovsky," gloomy, sardonic, dark. "Ferrari," the swarthy cockerel who now handed me my bags, and von Lutzov, pale, Slavic and grinning. "We saw your colours, and we bethought the Swiss sought to stop you reaching the safety of your homeland." "Indeed, Citizen Krasny. That's a good guess at the facts." I was getting the feel of my Spanish thoroughbred, believing it might soon be necessary to choose swift flight once more. "My name's von Beck." "Mary's teeth, sir!" Stefanik was admiring and joyful. "Not the same who went to France with Klutz." I saw further advantage, so I acknowledged him gracefully, a modest bow. "This is an honour," said Ferrari, suddenly less of a bravo, and the others joined in the flattering chorus. In truth, I had no notion of my fame, and unfortunately became still more conscientious in the light of this new responsibility. "I'd advise you," says I to the whole party, "that I'm no hero to the Republic. Paine is jailed, and so could Klutz himself be by now. Half the people who came with us to Paris are either dead, in prison, or fled. Robespierre rules France as a king, and terror attacks innocent and guilty alike." "Yet the tricolour remains in your hat, sir," said Krasny in boyish innocence. "Well, so it does, sir." I was in 2 minds. Would these young idealists, if told my whole circumstance, the mistake they had just committed, promptly turn upon me and arrest me? "Thus, sir, you show yourself not completely disillusioned," said Stefanik, his round face glowing in the cold air. "If all men of goodwill employed their energies in our cause, the injustices can surely be corrected. We have travelled a great distance, sir, to assist in your struggle. We met with suspicion and ostracism all the way from Austria, and even here in Switzerland." He put a thumb upon his discreet sash. I feared that, in giving him the negative view, I pulled the very bread of life from a baby's hand. "You'll meet with great suspicion in modern France, gentlemen. Foreigners are almost all assumed natural traitors by the mob, and the mob has no taste for fine argument. You'd be dead and stripped before you could cry Jacobin." Krasny fought for his bit of spiritual sustenance. "I fear that's mighty hard to believe, sir. Schiller, Beethoven, Wilberforce, Pestalozzi, De Paul, George Washington himself, all are honorary citizens of France." "As are you, sir. It is a brotherhood extending beyond nations." "No longer." I raised my hand, bored and even afeard of these familiar phrases. Believe me, I beg you, gentlemen, turn your attentions to some other moral purpose, or that of Poland's liberty, for instance. Her plight is more easily comprehended. Poland wants nothing but a king and bishops free to exploit whatever Russia and Prussia already claim for themselves, said Staszikovsky. Klutz preaches international liberation of the common people. So we concluded in a conversation amongst ourselves that Poland's freedom begins in France. Klutz's freedom ends in France. I swore at myself for my foolishness in pressing this point, and mark me, my young brothers, so shall your own. Krasny avoided my snatch at his heart's food and was firm in his reply. We shall try our luck at any rate, citizen, though we respect your opinions. Can we escort you part way on your journey, sir? Do you head for Dijon? I stretched a hand behind me. The last of Monsobier's men could be observed labouring up to the crest of the steep hillside. France lies yonder where those guardsmen flee. I hesitated for a moment. Myself, I journey to Lausanne. My revolutionary years ended with the last days of this past December. And why, Monsieur Hansney, why should you ever wish to leave the sanity and justice of Wildenstein? By repute, she's the most contented nation on earth. Contented burghers make poor insurgents, he said soberly. It's dull, my homeland, with self-importance and piety. Well then, sir, said I, it's plain to me it's the romance and adventure of revolution you're hungry for. You'll find plenty of the former in France just now, probably to your cost, but your romantic notions will scarcely survive, I think. Well, up piped the young Slav von Lutzow. Surely, sir, if France's situation is as you describe, our ideals are unfounded and the world is ruled by the seven vices, by the devil himself. Your hopes are not unfounded, sir, I replied. Neither shall I presume to question your generosity, your optimism, your faith, even your capacity to impose a little justice here and there upon the world. It is your sense of the horrid realities of life which is faulty, what we may truly term the common sense. It was lack of this sense, of a proper education in the motives of the vulgar people, which brought me to this pass. At the sound of what they might reasonably believe to be familiar pomposity, they became impatient and showed their mood by many little gestures, arranging their harness, straightening their backs in their saddles, adjusting their spurs, pulling their hats forward on their heads. These signs I took as indications that persuasion was impossible, so I saluted them. I bid you bon voyage and bonne chance, gentlemen. I thank you for my rescue. I trust in turn you keep your heads. Whereupon I rode my fine new horse, replete with a sabre and pistols, holstered on an excellent Castilian saddle, towards the cottage where now 2 women, one young, one middle-aged, stared from their gate. Then if you flee France, sir, came Krasny's puzzled complaint, well, who were those soldiers? Members of the National Army, sir, that which serves the Committee of Public Safety. I plucked the cockade from my hat and threw it back to Krasny, and then I was off at a smart trot, bowing to the ladies and complimenting them on the prettiness of their valley, the loveliest in vogue. They grinned and did not contradict me. I was in Switzerland. The mountains ahead of me were clear of political sanctities and hypocrisies. All I need fear in them were the usual natural dangers and the attacks of brigands who, if they cut my throat, would do it not for a cause, but for a crust or two of bread. The air had a wholesome freshness to it of a sudden. The road again grew steeper and the snow heavier as I ascended into the Alps proper. Peaks were soon in view as the sky cleared to a vivid blue. I, like nature, was suddenly tranquil. She revealed herself, noble and monumental and white and green, with black veins of rock and snow-covered pastures. Here, from time to time, little cottages, their thatched roofs stretched almost to the ground, crouched in sheltered ridges. Rooks and crows sprang up into the air at the vibrations of my trotting Spaniard. Those enormous pinnacles were one of the most uplifting sights on earth, outstripping even the Appalachian grandeur of America. The only others I have witnessed to compare, Well, lately I have seen engravings of the Rocky Mountains which seem, if the artist has not exaggerated, unequal to the Alps. This vast pile of natural beauty, those crags and fir trees and hovering hawks, whose echoing ravines and vast tumblings of snow and earth brought me swiftly to the understanding of my own insignificance, and indeed the insignificance of all human struggle. Thus absorbed in philosophic generalities, I scarcely noticed the growing twilight in my admiration of a scarlet sunset, staining every detail with its bloody light. As luck would have it, I was once again upon a fair-sized Toby, as my old friends of vagabond days used to call the high road. Twice I was passed by coaches whose drivers informed me of a reasonably clean and cheaply priced inn some 5 miles distant. As the sun faded, I entered a kind of corridor of trees whose interwoven branches blocked almost all the remaining light, and whose sweetness of scent came close to overwhelming me as it seemed I entered another world, a world where winter had turned to spring and peace triumphed universally. Soon after I heard the rattle of a 4-horse coach ahead, travelling at fair speed. As I approached, the driver whipped his horses recklessly, almost as if he feared pursuit. The thought came to me that perhaps this road had a reputation for attracting rogues and highwaymen. I paused him with a friendly halloo, so as to assure him of my own pacific intent, but he did not answer save to crack his long whip over his team. He had a lantern on a post by his head, and it cast shadows into his cape. All I could detect were eyes reflecting the yellow light. Was it my fancy made those eyes appear to glare at me with unwarranted ferocity? Whether this was true or not, I changed my mind about requesting his permission to ride beside his lantern. The darkness indeed became attractive by comparison. I left his cold yet fiery gaze in the tunnel as I broke out onto a grey landscape, now considerably colder, and with the mountains forming a black wall on every side. My clothing was still damp. I was like to freeze on my newly stolen saddle if I did not reach the inn soon after dark. If the air had not been dry and keeping the altitude, I might well have perished there and then. At last I perceived a glimmering on the curve of the road, and this soon became the cheering, diffused glow of several fires, lamps and candles on the other side of thick green glass panes, while the sign on a gallows post proclaimed the building as Le Coq d'Or. Almost every hostelry in Switzerland was named so in those days, the Swiss prizing conformity above all else. While beyond this was an archway leading to a large courtyard. The inn was of a good size and thoroughly appointed. I was approving, as very soon after my entry into the yard, ostlers with candle boxes were immediately on hand to take the bridle and lead my horse to a well-earned grooming and a meal of oats. Saddlebags shouldered and cloak dusted off as best it could be, I made my way through passages of old oak and older stone to the public room. Here I stood by the fire, steaming away like a coster's brazier, and causing chagrin to 2 priests, an Everden farmer, and a couple of heavily armed freelance warriors on their way, they said cautiously, to enlist with the Prussians and save France. I had unwound my sash and stripped off my jackboots and greatcoat for the one-eyed innkeeper to take to his wife for her attention, but doubtless I remained the picture of the communard, and my lank hair, unshaved face, and ungentlemanly apparel. It will take more than a pair of Switzer bravos to do that, said I, but you might as well try. For my part, I failed in the attempt, which is why I am presently taking myself as far from France as possible. Let him rot, is my view. You've just come out of France then, sir, said the elder priest in the eager accents of Provence. What news for us? I was no friend of his class, but yet was in little mood for judging or lecturing. I told him simply that priests were no longer being murdered piecemeal, which was true, but Guillotine's machine remains at work night and day, in capital and departments alike, I added, Many believe this will only end if Robespierre himself is killed. My opinion is that he's too cautious to expose himself to a Mademoiselle Corday. So he remains the people's darling, said the old priest in a sour tone. Let the mob stay on his side, I said, putting mulled wine of poor sweetness to my lips, and he'll rule France forever. If the mob turns, and 'tis ever a fickle creature, he'll fall. Yet that event's unlikely, eh? The priest was anxious for my denial. I could not give it. Sir, said I cruelly, it is impossible. Well, that speaks poorly for our family's famous second sight. At this, the priest's novice chimed in with a peal or two of his own. He was an angular, spiderish creature, prominently pale, with a tendency to blubber his lips when he spoke. Well, truly the devil's come to earth. This Robespierre is the Antichrist, so many have predicted. He will rise to his greatest power next year. Damn, sir, I retorted, if the Antichrist has not been predicted every other month since Anno Domini 1. How many can there be? If there were as many about as the oracles predict, we'd be knee-deep in him. There would be more Antichrists on earth than ordinary folk. I found myself grinning at my own jest, and I looked around the room. The odds are that 7 out of every 8 people in this inn are Antichrists. This set the marshals to guffawing, but it merely made the young priest bluster. Before he could reply to me, however, a clerkish fellow spoke up from the back. I had seen him slip in a few moments before. He wore the weeds of a bookman, and he ran his gloved fingers up and down his beaker with the distant air of private mirth so common to many of his calling, the kind who have much borrowed wisdom but little original wit. Is not the French mob as you describe, sir? Could you not argue for the congregation of a massive Antichrist as opposed to one? Would that congregation not be more effective than a single individual? Could Robespierre be no more than the crest upon the cockerel? The cockerel comprised in turn of 1 million peasants, or what have you? Perhaps, sir, perhaps, said I, scenting a tame boar, as it were, and wandered in from the barren forest of unearned learning. But this was not enough to stop him. One could tell how pleased he was with his humour. And might not that cockerel be in reality a cockatrice? His claws the claws of hellish revenge upon Christ's followers, his breath the breath of damnation, to set afire the whole world as a beacon, summoning all our souls to judgment. This aroused curiosity only in the wretched blubbering novice, who must come in eagerly with, "You ask these questions, sir, as if the answers are already known to you." The older priest turned to his Latin chapbook and his cup of ale, clearly no more willing than myself to maintain this deadly flow. "I merely converse, brother," said the bookman piously. "I offer speculation, never opinion." I was determined not to be trapped between the pair, so yawned loudly and spoke crudely with the impatience of a dedicated revolutionary official. "Well, master schoolman, the majority here are uninterested in your fancies. Speaking for myself, my feet are planted foursquare on this hearthstone, my brain's weary and capable of handling only the simplest of facts, connected with my body's necessities. Imagination brings only bad luck, believe me. Mine, at least, had a little originality in its day. Yours, sir, is all on hire from a library. By God, sir, it gives off a dust which even now irritates my nose. Let me not sneeze, sir, all over your fine weeds." At my snub he retired into his demi-octavo, but I was still threatened by his blushing co-philosopher, the novice priest. I turned on him with the habits of one who has been both a professional fighting man and a professional politician. "And as for Robespierre," said I, remarking to my surprise how the novice became unnaturally coloured, as if blood slowly filled up a parsnip from within, "he's the very model of fallible mankind." The novice was taking as a personal matter my slighting of the clerk. "I know him well enough," I continued. "He's vain. His vanity's hurt by the world's refusal to accept his remedies and become immediately enlightened. And what does a vain man do when insulted, sir?" The novice was now red as a boiled-over cooking pot. He hissed a little at me. It seemed all the liquors were evaporating. He lashes out, sir, says I. He seeks to portion blame. He fumes, sir. He attacks. In the case before us, such is his despotic power, he kills. He kills, sir. He wars on other nations. Mary's blood, sir, but this poor sphere of ours suffers more from the single frustrated egoist than from any natural or supernatural misery. Your own church's history, sir, illustrates my point well enough, eh? We are too frequently in the powers of mad children who rage and stamp and break kingdoms as they break toys. They order thousands of deaths a day as if they were spoiled brats kicking at their dolls. I had overstretched my statement and foolishly, through my weariness, invited further reply. Those who respect God do not behave thus, said our Provençal priest very primly. I uttered a laugh. The Pope cannot respect God in that case, sir. I'll not attack your faith, Father, but all your church provides for is a superior excuse for the same behaviour as Robespierre's, sometimes expressed quite as dramatically and executed with much the same apparent self-control as the dictator's. Was Richelieu any less guilty than Robespierre? The Huguenots did not think so, and the Cardinal also acted, he said, for the good of France. The priest shook his head at this. You have witnessed much distress, my son. I bridled. Sir, I am not your son. Your choice of words assumes an authority over me you do not possess. My radicalism, I thought to myself, was going to be less easily suppressed than I had supposed. His miserable wheedling having failed to gain him his expected effect on me, he became at once offended. Your experience has taught you nothing, sir. He raised himself to his feet, and with a fuss or two at his cassock, herded self and Novice off to bed, disappointed in his hopes for a grateful penitent, a comfortable ally in me. The two mercenaries were amused, and offered to stand me a further flagon. Since they were the only company I found at all congenial, I accepted their proffered jugs and warmed my bones with the contents. The youthful soldier, who was called Bamboche, had a pronounced limp, which he used for self-mocking comedy. His merry face was of the kind, as we used to say, to charm its owner out of a noose. He was joining the Prussians to avenge his brother, he informed me. Bamboche Major had been executed by the Revolution. He had been a member of Louis's own Swiss Guard. The older warrior was thick-set, matter-of-fact, a rogue with a cropped head, scars visible on every inch of his exposed skin. He told me that while he found French peasants obnoxious, their women were attractive enough, so fighting was better for him than staying at home where both women and men were unsightly. He had tried farming beyond Genève and had become bored. The work was no different in the effort expended, he said, but it took longer. One's free hours were far too few, and the choice of one's company severely limited. His name was Ulrich von Altdorf. He was a musketeer. He pointed to 3 swaddled guns in the corner. All good English pieces, he said, from Baker in London, and rifled for greater range, though the twist was not as exaggerated as in some of Baker's other guns. You could loose in accuracy what you gained in distance. But they make a good musketeer, and his loader the equal to a platoon in battle at long range. He was content to dismiss politics and lecture me on weaponry. I was weary enough to listen, with half an ear while his hobby horse was ridden through half the countries of the world, the quality of their steel and their skills at gunsmithery fully discussed. At length, drunk, I was ready for my bed. My 2 companions readily helped me up a flight or 2 of stairs to the garret with its row of truckles. Onto these, one by one, we fell, having made only the poorest effort to disrobe. Happily, they were no more fastidious, and smelled no worse than I. My dreams were of pursuit, of ancient monsters growling and furious as they sought to break free of the earth's deepest caverns, of an astonishing sweetness of atmosphere which filled my whole being with happiness, of hellfire, and Satan himself in a sea-green coat and a perfect cravat, hooking innocents by their pleading mouths and swinging them with busy aplomb into the furnaces. I awoke briefly in a sweat, put my nightmares down to bad company and worse wine, and returned to sleep, whereupon I dreamed I searched through rocky tunnels for the source of that sweetness I had earlier experienced. In the morning, as we shared a jug of water in a basin, I asked the Musketeers, since I must soon pass through that country, what they knew about Bohemia at the present time. They had little to offer. Austria, Herr Ulrich informed me, was by all accounts an easy-going master. As a result, Bohemia was effectively self-ruling. "If you're unwelcome in all these empires, sir," he suggested, "you should go to Venetia." He was adamant in his recommendation. The Republic of Venice, though somewhat severe in certain of her laws, could not penalise a properly contrite ex-revolutionist. With a smile of gratitude, I told him that my Italian was poor and my Latin not much better. I was anxious that they should not learn my true destination, lest they inadvertently release the information to my pursuers. "I have a mind to make myself rich," I told Ulrich. "I've been a poor fighting man all my life. I had thought to set up business in Prague, where, in the main, persons of consequence speak my native German." "Well," said Ulrich with consideration, "I've been in service in Venice, and I've seen service in Prague too. The only two advantages of the latter is that she's closer to Berlin and has drier streets." This simple joke heartily amused Bambosh, who, in his response, nigh spilled water over us all. "But the whores are better-natured in Prague," added Herr Ulrich as an afterthought, "if not so pretty. And cheaper by my recollection, though I'm not a man as often had to part with silver for a woman's favours." Holding back the remark that, since all men claimed the same thing, it was a wonder how the poor whores managed to keep body and soul together. Moreover, I preferred courtlier references to the fair sex. I withdrew from the conversation while I shaved off my whiskers with a dry razor, and then clad me in what had become my best, red nankeen frock coat, with waistcoat of a slightly paler shade, both held by amethyst buttons, sleek white buck-hide breeches which clarified every muscle they covered, fine doeskin riding boots, and atop this a fair peruke in need of dusting, but still with a trace of the old-fashioned violet powder I favoured. My linen was crisper than might reasonably be hoped after its hasty cramming into my bags, and my neckcloth came to my chin in a fairly decent ruffle. I was again a dandy to rival Robespierre, and my sword buckled in its undisguised scabbard of royal blue-gilded leather, I felt immediately more confident than upon the previous day. The soldiers, however, became less candid and friendly as my dress improved. I quickly mollified them with a wink that they might guess me a rogue in gentlemen's tailorings, and, despite contrary appearances, still one of themselves. I made a sardonic leg which had the older man grinning and the lame boy howling again. "One must dress rich to get rich," I observed, "and a widow who's not impressed by a rich man's fortune will frequently have her head turned by a poor man's breeches." "Ah," said Ulrich approvingly, "so you have a plan, to marry for your money." "Or for my initial capital only." Ulrich put one red butcher's hand upon my silken shoulder. "Then Prague is, after all, your best choice, brother." He stepped back from me as if I were a painting in a gallery. "Those Venetian families are mighty clannish, and careful with what or whom their fortunes wed. The Bohemians, on the other hand, are always grateful for any attention." Gravely I thanked him for his advice, and refused offence, even when he added in a thoughtful tone, "You'd have to be able to use that odd-looking blade in Venice, whereas the Praguers are impressed merely by a flash of steel." It was on my tongue's tip to take exception to this and boast of my Tartar training, but it would have shown poor taste other than to bow again, thank him graciously, and find some token compliment in return. This latter proved unnecessary, for just then his attention was distracted by noises from outside and below us. Ulrich cocked an ear. It was the sound of booted feet and the jangling of a great many harnesses. I knew the signature of regular cavalry, and I could guess its identity. I picked up my saddlebags and descended the narrow stair to the first landing. Through a window I looked down into the inn-yard, The coach I had passed that night was being prepared for the road. I saw a pretty little lady's maid step in, her quick smile unreturned by the dour coachman, who did not look quite such a sinister monster as he had in the gloom. On the coach's door I could now distinguish a discreet coat of arms which looked vaguely oriental and was not at all familiar. I guessed the coach's occupants to have reached the inn soon after me and gone immediately to their chambers. I now hoped I had been wrong in my opinion, that I had heard hussars. Several sturdy fellows standing near the coach wore dark coats and were heavily armed. All had a French appearance, but it was easily possible they were royalists turned brigand. However, I was swiftly informed of the truth when their leader emerged from the doorway below my feet. I saw only his back at first. He was tall and slender, his left arm bandaged inside his half-buttoned military coat. His tone was arrogant and impatient, and I recognized it. Robert de Monsobier had divested himself of his tricolour sash, and I guessed was making no claims to represent the French government. He turned to speak to an ostler coming up behind him. Monsobier's face was pale and set in harsh lines. "Prove it! Prove that my own horse belongs to me! Bah!" He had evidently found his stolen Spaniard. Without a horse, I was afraid I should find escape impossible. Nonetheless, I crept down the remaining flight of stairs, entered the kitchen, found it deserted, picked up some cold pork and cheese, and then returned to the stair to find a window where I could gain intelligence of Monsobier's position. I had reached a higher landing when I was alarmed by a sweet voice speaking with great merriment from above. "What, sir? Can't pay the tally?" I turned with thudding heart, barely remembering to hold the food away from my nankeen coat. Half in shadow, half in a beam of winter sunlight, stood a figure of the most striking good looks I had ever beheld. I could not initially be sure if it were youth or maiden, until she moved further into the light and I realized she wore skirts. Her head was large, and though her complexion was fair, her dark eyes were huge and her wonderful face was framed by brown curls. It was her broad shoulders and slim waist which gave her a slightly masculine look. Here was a woman with whom I could immediately fall in love. She embodied in flesh and blood the ideal of whom I had still occasionally dreamed. I paused, chewing slowly on a bit of tough pork crackling, and stared at her. Then I recovered my good manners enough to bend my body like a gallant of old, and a Tartar gesture, which stood me well in the West, salaamed to indicate that I was at her service. I hoped she might be enchanted, and it was true she seemed pleased by me, but she lost none of her clear-eyed assessment of my person. "Must I pay your reckoning for you, sir? You are clearly a gentleman, and I would not see you so demeaned as this." The crackling secreted in my hand, I shook my head. "You misunderstand, ma'am. I am pursued by enemies, kingslayers, who'll kill me if I do not immediately escape them. I could fight half their number, but these are too many." "You're a scalawag, then, sir? And those dutiful bully boys who peer with such rudeness into my private carriage, are they policemen?" "No, ma'am. They serve the Public Safety Committee of France, and I'm wanted as a royalist." She absorbed this information, nodding to herself. She began to button up her coat, which was cut like a man's hunting jerkin, and to pull on long gloves as if she prepared for a day's hunting. "What's their leader named?" "Robert de Monsobier, ma'am. But no threat can frighten him, no gold can pay him. He puts duty first and mercy a poor second." "I know his kind. I, by the by, sir, am called Libussa, Duchess of Crete." The house was unknown to me, but it should have my loyalty forever. Her bones seemed delicate, but were strong and large. Her skin looked soft as fine silk and glowed with health, a kind of wholesome fieriness which spoke of great strength of soul and of purpose. Her face, so serious in repose, so bright when lit by a witty retort was exquisite. She truly could have been the goddess of reason come down to earth. So struck was I by her beauty and character that I checked my usual responses, the kind I would normally make to a pretty woman. Where otherwise I might have played amusing fop and plotted conquest, I could conceive of no game in which this fair Madonna would not easily best me. I wished to have her respect more than I wished for anything in the world, so I merely presented myself, giving name and title and stating my business and intentions. "You'll require a friend to distract them while you escape, sir?" says she. "Ay, madam, 'twould be of great help." "Then get you as close as you can to the stables, sir." I obeyed. I would have done naught else. I was mesmerised by her. Republican feet stamped upon the landlord's gravy-stained boards. I fled to the back cloakroom, becoming lost in a collection of clothing which stank of every animal under the sun, but chiefly of man, yet could still hear my benefactress addressing the Frenchers with haughty impatience. Monsobier's retort was swift. "We seek a common horse-thief, ma'am, 'tis all. Should you come upon a little blown-up gamecock of a fellow, either wearing a coat 2 sizes too big, or breeches 1 size too small, I'd thank you for giving us word of him." It was all I could do to stop myself from springing from my hiding-place there and then and tearing his throat out with my own teeth. It was no comfort to me that his insults were the result of my having bested him so thoroughly the day before. My Labusse's tone was now placatory and charming. "Indeed, sir, might his name have been Von Beck? Or so he styles himself, aye. Why, I saw him off last night. So that horse was not his own. Lud, sir, and such a fine dapple. A half Arab, I'd swear." "Fresh horse," said Monsobier, taking her red herring. "Which way, ma'am, did the villain ride?" "I cannot recall, sir. My impression was that he travelled in our direction, however. Aye, I'd swear it. He said something of risking the danger alone." "Well, sir, that's the Lausanne road, of course. Since you'll be going in that direction, I take it you'll be kind enough to give us escort, at least part way, sir. The pass is famous for its brigands, is it not?" "We chase Von Beck." Monsobier then addressed one who was evidently the innkeeper. "You dog, why did you not say he'd taken another mount?" "I saw none missing, sir." The innkeeper's voice quavered. "A dapple, you say, madam? Perhaps, then, 'tis the property of one of the priests." I heard them all tramp out of the inn and enter the front yard. Creeping from the closet, I peered through a shutter onto the yard itself. Just as the 2 Helvetian knights-at-arms swaggered in view, all jutted scabbards and pistoled crossbelts, bits of leather and metal here and there almost at random upon their persons. Ulrich sniffed and glanced challengingly at Monsobier. The dapple captain was my beast. The innkeeper was taken aback. "What, yours was a roan, surely? I took her in myself." "The dapple, you fool!" Ulrich would have been a mummer in a pantomime with his exaggerated gestures. "With the packs. The boy here was leading her. Bambosh. Now you remember, eh?" In baffled defeat, the landlord acquiesced. Ulrich next strode up to Monsobier, glancing directly into the angry Frenchman's face. Ulrich spoke with measured insolence. "What company do you serve? Not cavalry by your rig, and not infantry by your boots and arsenal. You have the smell of Frenchies to me." "But what sort of Frenchie? Aristo or regicide? 'Tis plain you ain't Confederation fellows." I realised Ulrich performed this charade in order to benefit me, to confuse the pursuer. "I'm as Swiss as you, sir," muttered Monsobier, sensing a ploy but uncertain as to its nature. "Now, sir, you say this rogue took your dapple, a mare, was it?" "Liar!" Ulrich puffed himself up, all rattling gorget and creaking harness. "Liar, I say, sir. You're no Switzer." "From Bern," said Monsobier in a small, terrible voice. Ulrich looked the enraged Monsobier up and down, took a bend to one side and then to the other, arms akimbo. These were all the familiar tricks of a belligerent professional duellist, and to be sure Monsobier recognised them as well as I. but he refused the bait. He held his ground, face and neck bright red on his thin, dark body, like a bloodied spear topped by a black shield. He hated Ulrich, but could not be sure how many comrades the mercenary could call upon, and he wanted no extra trouble since he was illegally in Switzerland. "Where's your papers, Frenchie?" demanded the Swiss bravo. "I'm on a private mission, sir, and have no wish to fight a fellow soldier." Monsobier gritted fine white teeth so hard I thought I'd hear them crumble to powder. "We hunt the man who stole your horse. He's sought in France for treason, posted in Russia for an assassin, a rogue through and through, sir." "Of which there are none in all the Helvetian republics, as you'd know if you were a true Swiss. What's this fellow really stolen, sir?" Ulrich put his sinister, amiable face on one side. "Well, your damned horse, sir, for a beginning." Monsobier's temper released itself in the sound, like steel leaving leather. "What, the roan?" Monsobier turned to look at his uncertain followers. They seemed embarrassed, yet were hiding some amusement. Young Bamboche limped back into my picture. Evidently he had returned from the stable yard. "Someone's taken the dapple!" His loud exclamation was so melodramatic he might have been another actor in the Italian comedy. What was plain to me, however, was not plain to Monsobier, who had never served in the ranks nor got himself drunk with those who did. Bamboche was performing a ritual, old soldier style, which in itself was the normal preparation for a brawl. "Why'd the German take your horse, comrade?" Bamboche looked this way and that, and then fixed a glare upon Monsobier. "Is this gentleman involved?" "Well, he's a French notary, apparently," said Ulrich with feigned patience. "He claims my dapple's stolen by von Beck, who is like a brother to us." Bamboche turned round, eyes upwards, questioning Monsobier. "You say, sir, you saw Captain von Beck riding my comrade's horse? When was this, sir?" "Well, that was not my exact accusation." Monsobier was cold now. Bamboche looked to Ulrich. "When did you find the horse gone?" "I did not. The Frenchie says the roan's gone too. Go to the stable and see." Ulrich fixed Monsobier with a stern glare. For my part, I'd fear for the Swiss if he and the other were matched in different circumstances, but the farce continued to be played through, and my lady Lebusa, with her maid looking on, was as if it was a box in the opera. Monsobier was hating being made to seem such a fool. He breathed slowly and looked hard at his turned-back cuffs, plucked at frogging, put the heel of his boot in slushy dirt and ground it as if crushing a vermin. But all this while every individual in the yard understood that the tension could snap and bloody swordplay become the order of the day. Raising a fresh-trimmed brow, my lady pouted to display a patch, and this gesture filled me with shivering lust, such as I had not known since Catherine used me in her game with Prince Pushkin, when I was young enough to thrill at any promise, being barely 17 summers. But this excelled all previous sensation, even the episode with the Delaware woman I alluded to in my previous memoir. Blood. If this witch could move me with a smile, what ecstasies could her touch command? I was already Cupid's most abject slave. I dared not let myself speculate upon my chances of winning this lady's favour, for I was already threatened by the madness of Eros, as if a love potion and a remedy for falling ardour had been fed to me both at once. I was a man of reason, said I to myself, a cynic, though not the libertine of repute, who planned to marry a plain rich woman and so found a great fortune. Yet I hoped that I had intrigued the lady at very least. I had an undeserved reputation, little short of Casanova's, and sometimes this attracted women, particularly those who felt secure in their circumstances. The fact was that I knew little of the Empress's charms. I had been a pawn in some plot which doubtless had little point. Had I indeed been everything my legend credited me as being, I might doubtless be dead. Catherine rewarded discarded lovers, it was said, with icy death from her balcony. She was famous for her Pomeranian thrift. Back came Ulrich's loader. His tone was baffled and accusatory. "The roan's in the stable. It's not even saddled." "So she can't be stole," said Ulrich reasonably. "You call this man thief unjustly, sir." And now he blossomed into his role, almost grinning at the furious Monsobier. No Swiss man of honour, that is, no Swiss of any character at all, no Swiss person, however mean his station, would wish to be guilty of breaking the 5th, or is it the 8th commandment? Are you satisfied, therefore, that the matter's settled, sir? Shall you skulk back to your democracy, sir, and inform Monsieur Robespierre that you've accused a man wrongly?" "He stole my horse," said Monsobier, accustomed always to having his way, to winning all arguments, to riding all defences. He had not the sense to drop the debate there and then. "He stole my horse not 20 miles from here at Carbine Point. I was shot by him in his company, sir. Now play no more with me, and do. I see you're a well-meaning fellow, and you think you do right, but be assured Von Beck's a thief and a ruffian who wants a smart hanging." "The Black Hunter was stolen?" asked Bamboche, his blue eyes still wider, in fine imitation of bumpkin simplicity. "He should not be a soldier," thought I. "He should be performing Moliere." "The black horse, sir? Big Spaniard, sir? Saddle of fine Moorish work? Madrid style? Brass irons?" Monsobier saw what was planned. "Very well, I'll accept your verdict. I know my horse is here." "A true democrat, sir, but look you, these priests may have a vote. What do you vote for, brothers? Is Von Beck a thief?" The old tonsured, dried-up Father Sebastian mumbled as he lurked back in the shadows of the gables. "What's that?" Bamboche cupped his hand to his ear. The priest complained about that scalawag's godlessness, and was convinced without any doubt I was all Monsobier had said me to be. "Is he a wanted outlaw?" "Aye, father," said Monsobier politely to one of those whom he had cheerfully sent to the gallows in dozens only a few weeks earlier. "He has left a black trail across half the world. In Russia, through most of Europe, even in the Americas. A traitor to Saxony, assassin of crowns, he is vice personified." Monsobier spoke with unseemly relish. I began to fear that my lady, my new light of existence, should believe him, and was close to flinging myself through the shutters and, sword in hand, defending my honour to the death. Master Ulrich, however, was himself by way of defending my name as he moved on his insteps a little closer to his prey. "You say, sir, he's wanted in France? For what? For plots against the king, sir? For betraying your enemies, the Saxons? I am only a dim musketeer, sir, and fail to understand these paradoxes. I'd be obliged, sir, if you'd enlighten me." Monsobier, so used to power and the obedience of others, was again locked into rageful inactivity. His anger did not best him, but he was white-hot by now, and his fingers were lost in his fists. "I am bored with this, sir." His words were only audible for a yard or two, and I would not have caught them had I not been familiar with the voice. "I'll drop all charges and continue about my business." "Charges? You've authority here?" "Sir? Here in Vaud?" Monsobier made a movement, little more than twitch of his arm, and I feared for Master Ulrich's life. As it happened, just then one of Monsobier's disguised National Guard led into the yard the Spaniard I had borrowed. Monsobier was all solicitous attention suddenly. He studied the saddle as if for scratches, noted that the pistols were still holstered and the sabre in place. He looked at his horse's eyes and teeth, felt at her joints, reassured himself in what seemed genuine anxiety that she was unharmed. Then he put boot to stirrup, seated himself, and stared securely down at Ulrich, who stood leaning on the shoulder of Bamboche, the pseudo-simpleton. Monsobier's eyes were colder than all snows of Switzerland. "I greatly hope you gentlemen shall soon find yourself in my part of the world, so that I may return your hospitality." Another figure entered the picture and helped again to break the violent ambience. Out came the schoolman in his Quaker hat and grey inky cloak, with strapped oil-skinned books and a thong over his arm. His voice was blurred as if he had overslept. His skin, I noted, was almost as coarse and dirty and grey as his garments. "Is that the Lausanne coach?" says he, indicating my lady's carriage. "'Tis the coach of the Duchess of Crete," Monsobier offered a nod and a small smile to his only other potential ally in the gathering. The clerkish fellow blinked, saw my lady, removed his hat, and to display greasy hair dressed in a kind of half-hung plait. He seemed to recognise her, or at least her title. "I'm Meister Karl Platz, your ladyship." He was momentarily disturbed by what he understood to be a serious faux pas, and stood fidgeting in the mud of the yard. Monsobier was easy-mannered, almost unctuous in his courtesies, as he too lifted his heavy bicorn. "We'll gladly ride escort to ye, ma'am, until the pass is forwarded." He had found a graceful means of extracting himself from his embarrassment. To disguise his own confusion, the schoolman shouted rudely at the innkeeper, "Not the Lausanne coach! Odds fish, why are you all so late? I've waited an hour or more in my chamber, packed and ready. Snow will be falling by noon, look." It was true that white armies of clouds appeared behind the eastern mountains. Meister Platz sighed. "What shall I do?" He readied himself for the plod back to his apartment, but then my lady, who had been speaking quietly to Ulrich, called out from her window, "How far do you travel, sir?" Oh, how I wished she'd address those words to me. My body was consumed with a fresh wave of flame. "To Lausanne. My post is in Lausanne." Platz was pettish and surly. "My destination too, and Everton. Come in, sir." She flung open the coach door, but Platz hesitated, the fool. "You're welcome," said she. "The more we are, the snugger we'll be." I understood now that my wonderful ally was striving to draw off every possible enemy. "And you, reverend sirs?" she spoke most sweetly to those silly priests. The young novice started forward, but old Sebastian held him back. "Thank you, my lady, we have our own horses." He stared into the blue and cream upholstery with considerable regret. "However, we'll ride along with your party, if you'll agree, for safety." "Best check the stables, father," said Ulrich, striding off in that direction. "The Gallic general here thinks some Dutchie's stolen an entire herd, as far as I can tell. Why, he even claims the horse he rides has taken up the road to Freiburg. Perhaps 'tis a magic horse, sir, that can split itself in twain whenever it's needed to go in more than one direction." He clearly had decided that he had had the best of the encounter with Monsobier. With a mocking conqueror's laugh, he was gone from the stage before me. I knew I should go soon to meet him, that he was in league with my lady, but I wanted one last look at my vision of perfect womanhood. Monsobier, having lost any habits of common badinage he might once have possessed, could only shout at his men to mount in good order, straighten their hats, which now conspicuously lacked their red, white and blue cockades, and prepare themselves to leave. Yet he wondered, I could tell, as the old musketeer had meant him to wonder, if perhaps I was in truth galloping on a borrowed half-Arab for Freiburg, that he, Monsobier, had committed himself to escorting a pretty gentlewoman to Lausanne, the same blue-blooded, fastidious woman of wit and education whom he would, on his home territory, have thrown in a cart to be summarily beheaded by the merciful machine of sweet-natured Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine. "You'll not desert us, sir, I hope," called out my benefactress, turning those huge, wonderful eyes upon him. I almost swooned. "Without your generosity, sir, we should be in grave danger of encountering brigands. Think what would happen to my maid and I, not to mention this learned gentleman and 2 of Christ's servants. Oh, it chills my blood, sir." I admired her wit, and my impulse was still to follow her immediately. The melange of passions within my breast was near unbearable. When the coachman cracked his long whip and the horses hauled upon their harnesses, I was taken by surprise and all but fell backwards into Ulrich's arms as the coach went off. I was elated with love, with laughter at Monsobier's predicament. "Ah, How I should have liked to have been within her coach, her head resting upon the bosom of that remarkable and resourceful creature who could not be much past 1 and 20, yet bore the maturity and power to command. She had the quick habits of mind and intelligence of any veteran general. To see Monsobier dragooned into ensuring the safety of a fair sampling of the very people he regarded as his natural enemies was worth more to me than gold, and was ample compensation for the risk of exposure. Ulrich shook me, cursing, as I continued to look at the departing party. Monsobier, to his credit, had accepted the situation with reasonable grace. His sans-culottism was younger than his breeding, betraying neither stupid fawning on the lady, nor yet a frown of impatience. And, of course, as I am sure my lady designed it, he was so busy controlling his warring impulses that he did not for a second suspect I might still be at the inn. Ulrich and Bombosch had proved themselves good friends. Now the Swiss musketeer was growing vociferously urgent. With one final look at the coach as it took the road for Lausanne, I allowed Ulrich to lead me into the yard where a good chestnut filly stood ready. "She's all settled for, my friend. Off you go to wherever you please, but there's a short road on a high pass, should you wish to risk it on horseback." "To Lausanne?" "It'll have you there in half the time. 'Tis hard in parts, given to unstable snow, and there are sometimes robbers." "Well, I'll cheerfully risk all that." I was determined to get to Lausanne, collect my money from my friend La Harpe, and present myself as soon as I could before the inspiration of all poetry, that divine goddess, my guardian angel, the Duchess of Crete. Ulrich laughed easily. "You've a spirit to you, little captain, I'll grant you." I ignored his insult, affirmed from him the directions to the high pass, and was off at once, thinking of nothing but reunion with my muse, my feminine ideal. She had doubtless slipped some gold to Ulrich, for my horse was thoroughly equipped, and my own saddlebags were at my back. Upon my saddle was a scabbarded Bavarian hunting gun, almost as good as Ulrich's English muskets. My own Georgian flintlocks were also holstered there, together with a pouch of shot, a horn of powder, gun cotton, everything I should need for my journey. I began to suspect my lady a sorceress, or at very least a seeress, invested with a most convenient second sight. The tall mountains rose before me on the narrow trail, and I drew my old coaching coat about me, glad of its protection against the threatening snow. Yet within I was warm and knew great happiness. Soon I must see my heart's desire once more.